Hello, everyone. My name is Yitschak Rudomin, and welcome to the second video in a series that I'm going to be hopefully doing on the Holocaust that I call Positive Holocaust Education. I did one video already. It's about my parents' Holocaust survivor stories, where I describe my parents' experiences during the Holocaust, World War II, a little bit before, and also their experiences afterwards. So that's the first one. But this one really is more intellectual, you could say, more scholarly. And that is, I would like to introduce you to my own personal research on the Holocaust, beginning with my master's thesis that I did at Columbia University at Teachers College and completed it in 1983. It was officially completed. And the thesis is called The Second World War and Jewish Education in America, the Fall and Rise of Orthodoxy. Let me explain that a little bit. The Second World War. Well, you know what the Second World War is. It's that world war that took place between 1939 and 1945. That's the Second World War. Jewish education, when I refer to Jewish education, I'm talking about Torah education, traditional Jewish education, based on the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, and both the written and the oral law, meaning the Torah shebichtav and the Torah shebe'al peh. The written Torah, meaning the Torah, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the Torah shebe'al peh, the Talmud, Mishnah, Gemara, Midrashim, and all the related commentaries, as codified in the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, and that's normative Judaism. Call it Orthodox Judaism. I don't like stressing the word Orthodox. There's only one Judaism, and that is the Judaism of the Torah. Everything else is basically just human beings tampering with the Torah itself. Now, so the Second World War and Jewish education. So Jewish education is Torah education, basically. The Second World War and Jewish education in America, the United States of America. I don't have to explain that to you, where outside of Israel, most Jews live. There are about 6 million Jews in the United States of America at the beginning of the 21st century. And then the topic continues with a colon, the fall and rise of orthodoxy. The fall and rise of orthodoxy. I did that deliberately. I chose that title because of a famous book about Nazi Germany that's called the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by a man by the name of William Shirer. He was a journalist who lived in Germany and recorded the events of the Holocaust. And actually, he not so much of the Holocaust, but he recorded the events of the rise of the Third Reich. You know what that is, from 1933 to its fall in 1945. The Third Reich, Hitler's Third Reich. Reich means like a kingdom, a empire, the Third German Empire that lasted for 12 years from 1933 to 1945. So he calls it the rise and fall of the Third Reich, and I call my thesis the fall and rise of orthodoxy, meaning both in Europe there was a tremendous fall culturally, and then eventually with the Holocaust itself, and then there was a rise because after World War II, there was an amazing phenomenon that Torah Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, started to grow in huge numbers by leaps and bounds in the United States. And similarly in Israel. And this was due to the arrival of great scholars, Holocaust survivors, and the remnants of some institutions that were then rebuilt both in the United States and Israel. But the focus of my thesis is the United States because it's a neglected area, since the best known area of Jewish revival after the Holocaust is, of course, the birth of the State of Israel and the return of the Jews to the State of Israel and the ongoing growth of the State of Israel. Every decade since the 1940s, Israel's Jewish population has grown by 1 million. In the 1940s, at the time of the declaration of the State of Israel, there were about 600,000 Jews there, and then a decade later it went up to 1 million, and then another decade, 2, 3, 4, 5, and today Israel's Jewish population is at around 6.5 million. It's the country with the most number of Jews, greater even than America, I think. But nobody knows the exact number of Jews in America. The figure that's given is approximately 6 million, and the definition of Jew is becoming vague because due to assimilation and intermarriage and people leaving Judaism for other religions or just simply dropping out has confused the picture. But we work with a figure of about 6 million Jews in the United States of America at the early part of the 21st century, during most of the later part of the 20th century. And during that time and in that place, the United States, and among those people came the survivors, scholars, and private citizens who had survived the Holocaust, and they rebuilt Judaism. Now, why did I choose such a topic of the Second World War and Jewish education in America, the fall and rise of Orthodoxy? Well, for a number of reasons. Number one, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, so I have an interest in the Holocaust. But more than that, I'm interested in Jewish education. I'm a Jewish studies teacher by profession, even though I qualified as a teacher of history and English in secular subjects. But for most of my life, I've been teaching Jewish studies, Torah studies, mostly to young people, teenagers, college students, and adults who have little or no prior Jewish education, and then I lay it out for them in a professional manner. And I also had the Jewish Professionals Institute, which, as one of its projects, has positive Holocaust education. It's a name I gave because of the negative view of Holocaust education among some people. They get put off by it, meaning put off in the sense that it doesn't inspire them, even though there's a great interest in the subject, but it doesn't inspire them. It makes them frightened and question their Jewishness. So I call it positive education, positive Holocaust education. But coming back to the reasons, so I'm interested in Jewish education, and of course I've come to the United States. I've been living here since 1976. That's a long time already. And I studied in yeshiva, specifically the Yeshiva Rabbi Chaim Berlin, which is located in Brooklyn, New York. And I was privileged to meet some great rabbis and to see really the rebirth of Judaism in action. You know, the 1970s was only 3 decades after World War II. And I was still seeing the rebirth of Judaism, both among the people I was living and studying with, and in broader circles throughout Brooklyn, and further afield, Hasidic communities growing, yeshiva communities growing, Orthodox communities growing. And I realized that the outside world really didn't have a good perception of it, didn't understand what was going on. And it's really directly a result of the Holocaust, because Jewish education sprouted mostly during World War II and after the Holocaust. And why I chose the topic, the fall and rise of Orthodoxy, because Orthodoxy was on the way out until, you could say definitely, till World War II. Most people who had been Orthodox or been traditional in Europe or however they grew up we're dropping Jewish observance, we're dropping Orthodox observance. Most people came from Orthodox, or most Jewish people from Europe and even from the Eastern countries, from North Africa and the Middle East, came from traditional Orthodox homes, one way or another. But then as they moved to the United States, and as the time went on, they assimilated, they dropped their observance, the famous story of people arriving on the boat and then dropping their tefillin, their phylacteries, into the bay as the ship pulled into the harbor, because in America, nobody was religious, cutting off their beards and their payas, and women uncovering their hair, and assimilation in full bloom. And that still continues. We still have assimilation on a grand scale. We still have intermarriage on a huge scale today. Majority of secular Jews intermarry. But among the Orthodox, it's different. Among the Orthodox, there is still, you could call it a renaissance that has begun paradoxically as a result of the Holocaust, really as a result of the events of the Holocaust, strangely enough. So I decided to study this phenomenon and get into it. Now, I divided my thesis into various chapters, into 8 chapters in all, and I'd like to share with you those chapters, so you get some kind of overview of my areas of study. By the way, I'm reading to you now. This is my dissertation is published by UMI. They are a company in Michigan, and they publish dissertations. UMI. Here you can see. Can you see? And it's by the way, also I published my thesis connected to my website. So if you want to see it, you can read it free of charge. It's available online at www.jpi, P for Peter, jpi.org/Holocaust. Again, www.jpi.org/Holocaust. And there you will find this entire thesis. Now, the thesis, maybe I should just say, I dedicated it to my father. It says here, dedicated to my father, Reb David Alav Shalom, whose love of traditional Vilna helped him survive. And I spoke about my father's and mother's experiences during the Holocaust in the first video of this program, this series. So the first chapter deals with, it's the introduction, American and European Jewry at the crossroads, of how there was rampant assimilation in America for those Jews who arrived. And in Europe, there was also the Haskalah movement. And then there was the rise of anti-Semitism and the drumbeats of war as the Second World War got closer. And then I point out to some central ideas that I refer to, particularly of Rabbi Yitschak Hutner. He was a great sage. He died in 1980. He was the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva, and I had the privilege of knowing him for the last 4 years of his life, which were my first 4 years in the Yeshiva Rabbi Chaim Berlin. Rabbi Chaim Berlin is just the name of a rabbi who lived many years ago. It's not referring to any particular rabbi now. But he wrote an article on the Holocaust, which, by the way, he says should be called the Churban. Churban means destruction or tragedy. Like Churban Bayis Rishon means the destruction of this first temple. Churban Bayis Sheni means the destruction of the second temple. But he says that Jewish history, when destruction comes, it shouldn't be a surprise to us. When things like the Holocaust happen, it shouldn't be a surprise to us. It's part of a pattern of Churban, because there's Churban, then there's Galus, exile, and then there's Geula. So there's a kind of, it's a Hegelian triangle, dialectic of when there's destruction, it's followed by exile. And after exile, there's redemption. So it's no wonder that after the destruction of the Holocaust came exile. People went into exile, like in the time of the Second Temple, like following the Holocaust. People went into exile from Europe, came to America, and then there was redemption. Then there was a rebuilding. So that's one of the central concepts. You could say it's a religious underlying concept that guided me as I went about constructing the outlines of the actual work itself, the thesis itself. Then it's divided into 3 parts. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 begins with, it's part 1 has chapter 2 and chapter 3. The first chapter 2 deals with Jewish education in America, an overview, a difficult and troubled progress of Jewish education in America. Jewish education in America faced many, many challenges before it became established. It started from the times when they came over, the Dutch came over and they built a little synagogue and a little cheder. A cheder means a little school for children. And then there was attempts to set up a yeshiva. Yeshiva University was one of the first in the 1880s. And then other little institutions started, but the main institution was the afternoon Talmud Torah, where kids would first go to public school in the mornings, and in the afternoons they would go to Talmud Torah. Talmud means learning, and Torah means Torah, the Torah teaching, the Torah text. That's what the words mean, but it meant like an afternoon school where they would go for Hebrew lessons and some Torah lessons, and it was very difficult to compete with what the kids were learning in public school. Also, kids were resentful because whilst their mates were out playing, their playmates, they had to go to a second school, the Talmud Torah. So it was very difficult to educate kids. There were very few full-time institutions, day schools, or yeshivas, which they didn't exist really, because it only started mostly right before World War II and then with World War II. But there were attempts at the very beginning. So America, things were very difficult until the Holocaust. During the Holocaust, it was the Holocaust itself, where rabbis became like Shraga Feivel Mendlowitz. He was a great man, not a great-great-grandfather, but a great man who founded Torah and Masorah, the National Society for Hebrew Day Schools, and they gave themselves the goal to build a Hebrew day school in every Jewish community that had, I don't know, like something like 5 or 10,000 or 15,000 Jews. Any town with a smallish community of Jews should have a Jewish school, not just the Talmud Torah. And that was as a result of the Holocaust. So, and in Europe, what was happening, because I compared, this is chapter 3, in Europe, what was happening, there was enlightenment, that the traditional ways were melting away. By the time World War II broke out, in Western Europe, meaning Germany, France, England, those areas, they were all assimilated. They were mostly assimilated. The Orthodoxy had been wiped out. Those had originally been the cradle of Jewish Orthodoxy and of Jewish scholarship, but they were wiped out by the Enlightenment. People, the ghetto walls came tumbling down, especially after the Napoleonic Wars, and Jews were given their freedom to join society at large, and they just flocked to universities and to all the freedoms that society gave them. Many assimilated, many intermarried, and many actually became Christians. In Hebrew, it's called Shmad. What's the word in English? I'll think of it in a minute. But, and in Eastern Europe, apostasy, that's the word. Many became apostates. So you have the progression from assimilation, intermarriage, to apostasy. Assimilation, getting familiar with the ways, but still, it's like pre-intermarriage. You're still getting familiar with the outside environment, but you're still sticking with your own people. Then you break a next barrier, and you assimilate, you join outside society. And then, after a while of that, you break the next barrier, and you actually convert to Christianity, which is something that was very widespread, especially in Germany, very widespread. In England also. A famous case is Benjamin Disraeli. He was the prime minister of the British, and at a young age, his family converted to Protestantism. Same thing, Karl Marx. He was born Jewish. His real name is Herschel Levy, family name Levy, and they converted to Protestantism. And those are actually good examples. Karl Marx in Germany, Benjamin Disraeli in England. That was the trajectory of British and German Jewry as well as French Jewry during the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So by the time the Holocaust came along, many Jews were intermarried in Western Europe. Many Jews were highly assimilated, did not practice Judaism at all. In fact, did not want to be Jews at all. Yet when the Hitler came up with a final solution, they were all transported to gas chambers and murdered like any other Jews. But it was significant that there was this downward spiral. So there was a the fall of Orthodoxy. And in Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, there was a lot of interest in socialism and social democratic movements and in Zionism. So people, either a minority went to Palestine, which was under the rule of the Turks until 1917, and then after 1917, it was under the British, and moved there. But the majority of Jews in Eastern Europe became very influenced by socialism, but a lot still retained their Jewish identity. In Eastern Europe, in Russia, in Poland, in Lithuania, even though many were already assimilating, they had not reached the stage of intermarriage. And they certainly didn't reach the stage of apostasy, but they were on the way to assimilation, especially through socialism and socialist ideals, eventually Bolshevism, communism. And we know that the founders of communism in Russia, a lot of them were Jews. The first Bolsheviks like Trotsky was a Jew. He had gone to Cheder, and Cheder meaning Jewish elementary school, Torah school, and he gave that up and became a Bolshevik and a revolutionary. So that's a good symbol of the Jews in Eastern Europe. But many in Eastern Europe retained their roots, as we'll see. So that was a fall of Orthodoxy and of Judaism that preceded the Holocaust. On the eve of the Holocaust, that was the state of Jewry in the United States and in Germany. Now, moving on to part two, I call it the killing. Europe is, well, the section is called Into the Furnace. Part one is called Before the Deluge. Part two is called Into the Furnace. Europe became the killing ground, as we know. Now, there's debate among scholars. I just want to stop on this point. Nowadays, there is debate among scholars of what dates on to be taken as the beginning of the Holocaust. We know the Holocaust ended in 1945. In April of 1945, Hitler committed suicide, and on May 8th, Nazi Germany surrendered. A few days after I think April 30th, Hitler committed suicide, and then by May 8th, they surrendered to the Allies. Of course, the war was still continuing in the Far East until the United States dropped two atomic bombs on Japan, and that was in September, 5th or so. That it's called VJ Day. Japan surrendered. But so we know when World War II and the Holocaust ended, 1945. But when did the Holocaust begin? So there is a lot of debate among scholars. I remember when I was younger and growing up, Holocaust meant somebody who lived in Europe, not escaped from Europe before the war, but somebody who actually lived in Europe and lived through the times during 1939 to 1945. But since then, some scholars have come to reevaluate that, and they say the Holocaust actually begins from the time Hitler took power in 1933. I personally don't feel so comfortable with that date because there was no final solution as such. Then other scholars say it begins with Kristallnacht in 1938, when Germany destroyed all the synagogues in Germany and Austria. They burned down all the synagogues, and they murdered about 1890 Jews on the streets, and they put many thousands of Jews into the first concentration camps. Others then say that it begins with 1939, and others actually say no, it begins in 1941 when Germany invaded Russia in June of 1941, and they sent out what's known as Einsatzgruppen, which means execution squads, to kill people with machine guns and rifles through execution by bullet, death by bullet. They call it Holocaust by bullet. So some actually begin the Holocaust from there, because that was a conscious decision by the Nazis to go out and massacre Jews using bullets, machine guns. But they found that to be inefficient. And so then they came up with a final solution in 1942 after the Wannsee Conference, and they had a meeting of top Nazis and decided to build death camps, not concentration camps, death camps like Auschwitz and several others. We'll talk about them, where they set up death factories where people would be gassed to death, either by Zyklon B gas or trucks and lorries being attached to with pipes, the exhaust being attached to rooms where they would gas people. And that was a method. There were several methods that they used to gas people to death and then burning their bodies, either burying or burning their bodies. Eventually, even the bodies they buried, they dug up and reburnt them. But so that decision was only made in 1942, and some have said that is the real Holocaust, because that's when the so-called final solution, Endlösung, das jüdische Frage, however it's pronounced in German, the final solution. So again, I'm leaving this open. You decide. I think the Holocaust Museum in Washington goes with the broad definition, the 1939 to 1945 definition. So even, let's say, German Jews who escaped from Germany during the 1930s are considered to be Holocaust survivors. Whereas if you go with the definition of only 9 people who lived in Europe from 1939 till 1945, so they are Holocaust survivors and not people who escaped before. But either way, those are terrible times, however you want to look at it. And eventually, Hitler and the Nazis did make Europe into a killing ground. So that's what became of the Jews of Europe. If you had a passport, you were able to escape somehow. Some people managed to get exit visas. There was the famous Wallenberg case where a Swedish diplomat was able to save people in Hungary. There was the case of the Spanish diplomats who were able to give out visas. Yes, there was such a case that Spanish diplomats saved people, saying the Jews were descended from Marranos. But basically, the Jews of Europe were wiped out, as we know, the majority of them, very few survivors. So that's as far as Europe goes. And an important thing to bear in mind among the Orthodox was the commitment to a concept called Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name. Sanctification of God's name. Every Jew has to sanctify God's name, meaning you have to be on your best behavior. But especially if push comes to shove, it means when a Jew is lined up to be executed, he should go with dignity. He should show his adherence and allegiance to God and to Judaism. He should not give up, and he should die with hope that it's not the end, it's only the beginning, because there is an afterlife, and that God will punish the wicked and reward the righteous eventually. Okay? So Kiddush Hashem means giving your life. And there was a famous case of Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. He was a great rabbi during the Holocaust in Lithuania who was executed. And he made a statement that let us go like perfect sacrifices and not have negative thoughts to blemish the sacrifice. and this way we will be able to sacrifice our lives so that our brothers and sisters in America should be able to live on. So he saw themselves, many of the greats in Europe saw themselves as giving their lives so that the survivors, meaning mostly in America at that time, because after World War II, America was the greatest bastion of world Jewry, of the world's Jews. It was a free country, so you could still rebuild. The 3 million Jews who were in Russia, or the 2 to 3 million Jews, were under communism, so they were behind the Iron Curtain. There was no freedom there to revitalize Judaism. And the Jews in Israel were only starting out. They were very small. There were only about 600,000 Jews in 1948. But after World War II, there were already 6 million Jews living in America, plus now a stream of survivors coming in. So you could say, and this is not my idea, this is Rabbi Hutner's idea, the center of Torah moved after the war to Israel, to the United States, from Europe to the United States. And then later, as Israel grew, particularly after the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, and there was more migration to Israel from Arab countries, from the Soviet Union, from other places, and with natural growth, and Torah institutions flourished. So by the beginning of the 21st century, Israel is now the center of the Torah, although America is also very much part of it, because many institutions in America are deeply connected to the Torah institutions of Israel. So World War II saw the transference of the center of Torah life of Orthodox life, or you could say of Jewish life, from Europe to America, right? And therefore America became like a land of great hope. Now, part 3 I call Revival in America, chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. Chapter 9, though, is just a conclusion, but chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, chapter 6 deals with American haven for Yavne and its sages. I don't know if you're familiar, and this is very apropos, to understand the mentality of the rabbis who rebuilt Judaism and rebuilt what we see today, the Hasidic communities, the Yeshiva communities, the Orthodox communities in the United States. They were imbued with a spirit of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, who is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? He was a famous rabbi who lived during the times of the Roman siege of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Before Jerusalem was destroyed, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to, through his students, smuggle himself out of Jerusalem. He was in Jerusalem, which was being held by Jewish cliques that did not want to surrender, wanted to fight to the death. But the rabbis at the time said we need to negotiate for peace, believe it or not. We should not fight to the death because the Romans were much, much stronger. The Romans at that time had conquered most of the world, and they were like the superpower of their age. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai smuggled himself out of besieged Jerusalem, and he went to talk to Vespasian, who was the general in charge of the armies, the Roman armies, fighting the Judeans. That's how the Jews were called, the Judeans in Judea 2,000 years ago. And he pleaded for him to preserve the Jewish scholars, to preserve Yavne, and to preserve as much as he could of the Jewish people. Later, he had regret that he didn't ask him for more, but he was so not confused, but flushed, you could say. He was so overawed that he managed to escape and was facing the emperor. He did ask, the main thing he asked for was for Yavne and its sages. Yavne v'chachameha. Please spare the town of Yavne and its sages. That's where Jewish scholarship was being held, outside of Jerusalem. And he asked for a couple of other things, and Vespasian agreed to his demands. So you see, in times of danger, when everything is about to be wiped out, for the last 2,000 years, what have the Jewish sages, the leaders, the Torah leaders of the generations been inspired to do? What have they wanted to do? They wanted to preserve the Torah and its sages. If you can preserve the Torah and its sages, you will ultimately preserve the Jewish people. Because Torat Chaim, it's the Torah of life. It's a tree of life. The Torah somehow miraculously, it's the link between the Jewish people and God, as the Jewish sages teach. Yisrael ve'oraisa v'kutchabrichu chadhu. The Torah, the Yisrael, the Jewish people, and the Torah, and the Holy One, blessed one be He, are one. It's the Jewish Trinity. The Jewish Trinity is Yisrael, the Jewish people, the Torah, and God are one unit. So by and the link is the Torah. If you preserve the Torah and the Torah scholars who keep the Torah alive, then you will preserve the Jewish people de facto and de jure eventually. And that's what happened. So America became a haven for Yavne and its sages. Because during the Holocaust, the 6 million Jews who lived in America were, if I can use a phrase, if you'll allow me, they were out to lunch as far as being Jewish was concerned. There was very little true Jewish observance. Reform was the main way Jews were observant. Conservative was another main way that Jews kept Judaism. But that was not Orthodox Judaism. That was not the tradition. As Reform implies, it's a reformation. It's a change. The Reform movement does not believe in the divine origins of the Torah. That it does not believe that God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. It does not believe that the commandments are therefore compulsory. So therefore, they do not keep the Sabbath. They do not keep kosher. They do not keep many of the laws because they feel that they've come to the conclusion that Judaism has to be reformed. And conservative originally tried to have it both ways. A little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of another thing to just try to keep things together. But eventually they went on the slippery slope, and today, in the beginning of the 21st century, there is not much difference between Reform, conservative, and the rest, reconstructionist, humanist. They're all more or less one generic non-type of observant Judaism, or non-observant type of Judaism. So, or if they can be called Judaism at all, I don't want to be insulting, because people are sincere. They are trying to be, to keep up something. So it's, as a rabbi of mine once said, there's no such thing as Reform Jews. There's only Reform rabbis. The general population is sincere. They're just nice people who mean the best. But it's the theologians that make up the differences and keep the schisms going. So before World War II, America was out to lunch. And had things continued the way they were going, Judaism would have eventually disappeared with the Jewish people, as we see today among those sectors, the Reform, conservative, unaffiliated, secular, atheist sectors of people who are so-called Jewish, or even do claim to be Jewish. There's not just rampant assimilation, there's rampant intermarriage, and of course there's rampant apostasy, shmad, where people are converting to Christianity and other faiths. So that was what was going to be the fate of American Jewry, and it changed. Yavne and its sages, because great sages came to me, and I have not specified the names. We'll leave that for another video, specifying who they were. When they came to America, they built Hasidic communities. There were no Hasidic communities in America before World War II. There were maybe 3 or 4 yeshivas in America before World War II, a handful. Today, there are hundreds of yeshivas in America, and Beis Yaakov's, girls' schools. And there were hardly any day schools. There were 1 or 2, Yeshiva Flatbush, the Maimonides School. These were modern Orthodox day schools that had started right before World War II. And the people who came before World War II, by the way, the rabbis and those who assisted them, were motivated with the same spirit. They were basically also, you could say, like Holocaust refugees from the 1930s who today are regarded as Holocaust survivors, right? So they were imbued with that same spirit and infused with that same spirit to rebuild Judaism. So they rebuilt, like Yeshiva Torah Vadas. They built the Yeshiva Rabbi Chaim Berlin. They built up Yeshiva University. They built Yeshiva Ner Yisrael. There was a yeshiva in Connecticut. There were a couple of yeshivas here and there, but nothing great. Nothing. It was very, very difficult. And the same thing with day schools. There were no real Jewish day schools. Day school means where they have a lot of secular education in addition to the Jewish education. So those things were very minute, relatively speaking, before World War II. But after World War II and after the experiences of the Holocaust survivors came along and provided not only leadership, but a cadre of laymen and lay women, lay people who would want their children to have a Jewish education. For example, I lead tours at the Holocaust Museum in downtown Manhattan in New York City. And I specialize in leading tours of Jewish schools. So when we have children from, for example, Beis Yaakov's, not so much yeshivas, the boys don't come that much, but the girls come, or even from Jewish day schools, we have boys and girls who come, religious boys and girls who come, and you ask them, how many of you have grandparents, because by now it's grandparents, who were Holocaust survivors? 80 or 90% of the hands go up. So you see that their grandparents handed a spirit over to their parents, and then to them, they want them to be in these religious schools, these Jewish schools, to learn Torah and to stay committed in the positive sense, to stick with a Torah way of life. And then you had, after the Holocaust, of course, chapter 8 deals with Rebbes and Hasidim and Kehillas. A Kehillah means a community. Many Rebbes, the most famous ones, were the two Lubavitch rabbis who came over in the 1940s from Europe. Rabbi Yosef Yitschak Schneerson was the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, and Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson was the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe. They were both survivors from the Holocaust. There's famous stories. The 6th Rebbe was saved with a German officer who had some German parentage and gave them a visa. It's a whole long story that's interesting. At one point, we maybe can get into it. And the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe was hiding out in France. He was smuggled out and came to America around 1942 or 43. The 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe came in around 1940. The Bobov Rebbe, the Satmar Rebbe was in Bergen-Belsen and was miraculously saved. Many of them, they were all, everyone has a story among these great Rebbes of how they were saved. And then when they came over, they started from scratch. There was nothing for them. They had maybe barely a minyan, of 10 people. And they built up from there. So that's the rise of Orthodoxy. And then finally, chapter 8, I compare the two post-war successors. If you compare the rise of the yeshiva, that's among the more Haredi sector, and the yeshivas versus the Jewish day schools, that's among the more modern Orthodox. The difference between the Haredi and the modern Orthodox believe in much more secular education, sending their children to college. They have co-education, meaning boys and girls are in the same schools, and they're very pro-Zionistic, pro the state of Israel, whereas the Haredi is less secular education, Haredi, Hasidic, less secular education. Boys and girls are strictly separate, less emphasis on Zionism, and very little going to college, no emphasis on that. But these different directions reflect the ideologies of these of the leaders and of the type of people that they are. So a great change came about in the United States and in Israel, but in the United States as a result of the Holocaust. Paradoxically, 6 million Jews were murdered in Europe, but on the other hand, 6 million Jews in the United States received a new lease on life. So that is very, very significant that America, what's known as the desert of America, the materialistic America, the America that was not so welcoming to even Jews and to traditional Judaism, all of a sudden, directly as a result of the events of the Holocaust. Once you go into the details, you see how, when, and why, and what, and which were influenced by those survivors who came over and established a whole new life that's thriving to this very day. So thank you very much for listening. That was an outline to my thesis, The Second World War and Jewish Education in America, The Fall and Rise in Orthodoxy. And that's part of my Positive Holocaust Education program. We'll go into more details in coming videos. You can read my thesis online at www.jpi.org/Holocaust. And my name is Yitschak Rudomin, and I'm signing off. My email, if you want to reach me, is rudomin@jpi.org or rudomin@att.net. Thank you so much. May we hear good news only.